Hi, Adrian. Appreciate you taking the time to join this podcast. I love it if we could start off with you almost walking me through your journey in data.
Sure, sure. I mean, let's just. I'll keep this one as brief as possible because I'm sure many people don't really want to hear my whole CV. We don't have to give a spiel. This is not an interview, is it? So, what I've worked both in and with data for the last 20 years, and I like to sort of give that separation. I'm an analyst at heart, and that's how I spent my first almost 10 years of my career. And it was being an analyst that made me realize that actually there was more to the data that needed to be done than just playing around with it in spreadsheets and SQL statements. And inadvertently, I ended up, without even knowing what they were, ended up in the field of data management and data governance. And it kind of just snowballed from there. And I ended up becoming the uh, owner of the principal data platform for an international bank in the UK, and becoming the later on, I joined a fintech as their head of data, and I've now taken on other leadership positions and directorships within the data world. So that's where I've been for the last. That's my last quarter of a century.
Appreciate that. And obviously, you mentioned for the past 25 years, you've sort of been in and around data, leading teams as well.
Mm.
How, how have you seen data evolving over the last 25 years?
Oh, it's expanded massively. I think just the pure volume of data that we deal with has been the biggest change overall. It's seen huge amounts of usage as well. And whereas data was pretty much a specialization of finance teams, certainly within the banking world,
Hmm.
and the finance world, it is branched out now to be used all the way across the business.
Hmm.
Uh, it's no longer the realm of techies and people who residing in their cupboard somewhere. It's something which is now embedded throughout the holding organisation. So I think just pure volume and the level of importance of data, it's just increased. It's just and it continues to snowball and it continues to increase. And I think just the number of people who are also involved in data in the various fields. Whether we are talking about it from a technical side, or we're talking platforming. I mean, that's in itself has exploded. If you think about, just say, take the Azure platform, the number of products that you have under one single provider is just immense. Whereas previously we were based on SQL Studio and SQL Server, and it was that was it, and that's how you could use it. Now you can just do so many more things. Um, and a number of power apps that would come underneath that as well. And while that's remained fairly stable, the ability for you to be able to use them and integrate your tools across the board has just increased massively, and it will continue to. I think as we are, I suspect we'll talk a bit about AI later on.
Hmm.
Um, that's continued, and it will continue to help with this. I think what I see is democratization of data across the industry and across organizations.
Yeah, that's something that I've been hearing as well when I've been speaking with a lot of data leaders, and it's
Yeah.
something as well. The fact that it's not just like you say, some a techie person in their basement doing
Yeah.
statements with SQL and this kind of
Yeah.
thing. It's kind of gone across to every part of the business. So I
Mhm.
guess that leads me to my next question: is what elements do you think need to be in place for a successful data strategy, especially when targeting a high ROI with the investments that you make?
Yeah, I mean that's something which is just really interesting because a high ROI is something which I personally I think is the most important thing because so much of data departments are considered to be cost centers, and I think they still are. I
Mm,
think there's a huge push still towards technology over rather looking at output and functionality. And you can see that with in the jobs market where many heads of data roles are actually technology focused. They're looking for heavy tech stacks. They're looking for ML and AI implementations without actual any rhyme or reason for it. And I think it's the same way if we look at it the other way. It's not about dashboards and it's not about building out the biggest and fanciest Tableau dashboards that you've seen.
mhm.
But to me, it's about trying to think about, and it's working so closely with the business in creating a strategy which supports and supplements to what we want to be able to achieve as an organization. So I'm thinking here about minimum. minimal viable products. So thinking about lean, and that might be something where actually we start to work with, for instance, working with a products team. The
Hmm.
product team or the marketing team can actually they can see a particular element that you can try and assist with. Can you actually do something about it? Because that's the real key. It's not just about building something where you say, oh, if we did this, we could do this. The point is, can you do it? Can
Hmm.
you actually change what you're talking about? If you can, try to think small. So I think too often we get too caught up with trying to deliver wholesale changes rather than trying to create something which is small and applicable now.
Right.
So often the market keeps changing, your customers change, the external environment changes. So you need to be able to think big, but start small. So whether that's actually putting something initially on a spreadsheet, or whether it's actually a manually run SQL query, or even if it is a dashboard, make sure whatever you're doing, actually you can prove it. So try and do that A/B testing. Once you can get that testing in place and you can actually show that actually what you're doing makes a change, scale it up as fast as you can. That's why it's important to keep that link between data and operations live. And I
Hmm.
think that gets forgotten about so often. And instead, we go on to either building out the biggest and best tech stack that perhaps you don't ever need to be able to do, or even you might even have some really great ideas. But at the end of the day, if you can't actually action those ideas, then all you've got is a document, you've got meaningless words.
It's interesting that you mentioned starting small and then trying to scale it out rather than, starting off by investing in the biggest tech stack. I
Yeah.
guess something that I hear a lot is a bit of hesitance from maybe less data driven departments that then have to sort of align their processes to what your vision is. How do you kind of translate that and beat that resistance from less data driven departments?
I think it's always about storytelling. Storytelling and communication is the absolute key thing to do. I don't think there's anybody who actually says, I don't want to use data. I think everybody wants to use it. They're just hesitant to do it because they don't necessarily trust it. And that might be because they don't have a trust in their own skills or abilities, or even just a lack of trust in the data that you're producing them. I think lack of trust in data is endemic within organisations because data quality still remains such a big issue.
Mm.
And we're not able to actually measure data quality. We don't capture the requirements and put the standards in places. So we need to create this lack of trust. And then if you'll become I was reading a post this morning from Tris Burns, who's a great data management coach, and he used to be the CDO for Pizza Hut. And he was talking about how many companies become dashboard factories. And that is a real problem. I worked certainly for somewhere, and I came in. They were a uh, dashboard factory resolving for KPIs. That was purely what they were doing. There was no rhyme, there was no reason for them doing it.
Mm.
It was just they were constantly trying to put out bonfires with all these dashboards that they were doing, and they were producing hundreds of them. There was more dashboards than there were people, and those dashboards lacked any credibility because they were constantly being churned out without any form of scalability around them. There was no consistency in them. So you had metric A and metric B, which were actually basically the same thing on two different dashboards, and they weren't consistent. So that's why people don't want to use it. And that's when you end up having that resistance. Because what's the point in trying to engage with something that you're constantly fighting about with, and you're constantly having to try to rework and reuse and look at it from having to go back and actually spend so much time in building out your reports. And
Hmm.
I've worked in places where the end of month process has been a real big issue. It probably takes half a month to do the end of month reporting because they're just constantly having to churn and attach and clean the data, and that just becomes just such an exercise in trying to produce something which, in reality, then it's not a value added exercise.
Hmm.
So you're getting that pushback, and people don't want to use it.
We talk about that value added exercise and that data can be seen as a cost center, but obviously implementing data, maybe the use of predictive analytics, things like that can bring tangible top line revenue. Talk to
Yeah.
me a bit more about that. How can people use data to improve their revenue?
Okay, I can give an example on this predictive analytics. I know we discussed this before. Um, I was running in an organization as a head of data, which was working on the loan space, and inevitably some customers were going to start to go bad.
Mhm.
And in this day and age, anyone's ever got a finite amount of resources to service their needs. Now, I trust people, and I think people will always do the right thing. Well, most people would want to do the right thing, and they want to pay their debts. At the same point, as the organisation, they were constantly gathering information regarding people's credit scores.
Right.
So we knew actually when people were having a declining credit score before they'd actually gone late in their payments. So we're able to use that information and actually say, well, let's see actually what difference does it make going out to people in advance.
Hmm.
So saying to people, well, actually, we know times are hard, we know times are tough. We can do it as the contract is actually breakable and it's the provider doing it, not the customer.
Hmm.
How about we can go into and do a contract? We can do a payment arrangement, or perhaps just hitting onto the psychological impact of actually reaching out first and trying to get onto the top of the payment pile.
Hmm.
And I found that had a huge amount of impact to this organisation. I know why you might not say that's so predictive. It's trying to sort of use the data as much as possible. Another way of trying to use predictive analysis was on customer segmentation.
Right.
The same organisation was consuming a huge amount of information, storing it, and it stored it for years without using it. So we actually pulled that data back and said, well, actually, who actually are the custody? Who are the organisation's customers,
Hmm.
and how do they behave? Because you're sending out an email, you could be sending out an email to someone who's 19 years old and is still in university, or you might be sending an email to someone who is 65 years old and just retired. Well, they don't respond to emails in the same way. You've got to target your message, and no one target. If you can target a message as precisely as possible, you're going to have as much impact as you possibly can.
Hmm.
So it was taking that data and actually recognizing of who your customers are, and then using it as a bespoke package to format your communications, marketing to those particular markets. And that had also had a great impact as well. So instead of sending out blanket emails to people, you're now actually targeting people effectively.
It's something you mentioned was that this particular institution sat on this data for quite a few years, didn't
Yeah.
know what to do with it. And something that I hear a lot is almost like this. Obviously, data, it's a science, but then how you use the data and what you do with it is almost an art. So you're asking the right questions and using the data to test your hypothesis. Where what's the skill involved with asking the right questions, and how much time do you spend almost theorizing what to test with the data?
That's interesting, that is, isn't it? How do you actually find it out? Once again, it's all about communications. Do you know,
Hmm.
I think it's communication is the absolute key to data. You
Hmm.
can build an absolute perfect textbook perfect data organization. You can have a fantastic tech stack. You can have the right analysts in place. You can have the great best modelers and the best architects. You can have the best BI tools that you can possibly do, and they can follow, they can produce some fantastic graphical interfaces now for users to be able to use. But unless you have that right level of communication, then you don't know what to be looking for.
Hmm.
You don't know what their people are going to be looking for. So you need to build up these communication channels. You need to be part of the business. Now, for anyone who wants to be a leader in the data field, needs to realize that actually they're going to have to wear two hats. They're going to have to wear the hat of a data leader. So that does involve them obviously doing those before mentioned things, but they also need to bear the hat of being a business leader.
Hmm.
And that means doing this, it is a cliche term, but that does mean doing a lot of stakeholder engagement.
Yeah.
So understanding what people actually truly need. When you start actually understanding that need, and we come back to then aligning ourselves with operations as well, so you can actually action what you're doing and you do actually produce actionable insights, because that's become a buzzword which is being thrown around the industry like anything. I don't know how many people do generally produce actionable insights, because if they are producing actionable insights like they are, then they're doing some incredible work. Most people are just producing fantastic Power BI dashboards, which don't include actionable insights, it includes suggestions.
Hmm.
So therefore, actually what you produce, therefore, is a report, which is
Yeah.
congratulations, you can't actually do a report. So it's about trying to talk to people and say, look, this is what can we do together? How can we actually utilize what we've got? Oh, sorry, the internet connection gone.
All good. You're back now.
Sorry, okay, yeah, it just told me it gave me a warning up there.
That's all good.
3, 2, 1, back in the row. So it's about trying to get that level of buy-in from everybody else who wants to be using the data and working alongside you to say, look, this is what we need to be able to understand, and for us to be able to say, this is what we've got. So it works that two-way. Otherwise, you're going into the supermarket. People are coming into the supermarket hungry, but all the food's got blank labels on it, and it's all behind locked cabinets. And what's the point? You can have the best things in the world, but if people don't know what to go to or where it is and how to actually use it, you've got nothing.
Mhm. It's interesting because does the onus come from the data leader to instruct the business on where should we be looking with the data, or does it come from the business instructing the data leader on, okay, we're gonna expand in, let's say, to a new territory. Should we go to territory A or territory B? Use the data that we have to
Yeah.
make that decision.
That's when it becomes a bit sort of a blurred line on there. I've often pushed back at being the head of insights. I
Right.
don't necessarily think the data world works as the insights. They provide the insights. It's up to the marketing teams. It's up to the credit teams. It's up to whatever the growth teams. It's up to them to interpret the data. Sometimes it's you to help them and hold their hands along the ways. And I'm sure some people will be completely disagreeing with me on this respect. But I think they're the experts in the data. That the data
Hmm.
belongs to the business as a result of a business process. That's why it's been produced. If it's not, then all it is if it doesn't get used like that, it's a byproduct.
Yeah.
And therefore it's almost byproducts and waste products. And if it's not Marmite, then it's not worth having. So if any you hate Marmite, by the way, then that doesn't really
No,
work there.
I quite like it, to be honest.
But it's got to be a joined up. It's got to still be a joined up impression, though. You know, I can say, oh, it's down to the business. It's not. It's you putting that business hat on. You sometimes taking that data hat on. Understand it. So go and take those people. Go and take them on a journey, and show them what is actually feasible and what's possible for you to be able to do. So sometimes you've just got to step out of your comfort zone for a bit and take those guys and lead them on that journey and see where you can get to.
Something that I've been reading about recently that I find quite interesting is the difference in regulation with the UK, EU, and then the US, and
Mm.
the impact that that's going to have on the AI race, technology development, but then sort of regulations for core businesses as well. Talk to
Yeah.
me a bit more about your opinions and what challenges you think over regulation can have, and then under regulation as well.
Yeah, okay, let's do the first one. And so let's do over-regulation to begin with. Yeah, it can be stifle. It has the massive, but AI is going to be, well, it is a huge shaker in what we're doing. You know,
Hmm.
if go on the Gartner curves at the moment, it's not reached the point of where we're saying people have got bored of it, and it's not reached that plateau of, was it plateau of production?
Yeah,
So,
peak of inflated expectations.
that's it. That's the one. So it's on a downwards curve now. So people have obviously started to use it, but I think it can go way further still. I think we're only still seeing the tip of the iceberg. The way that Microsoft are now embedding Copilot into everything
Hmm.
is going to massively shake up that market. Now, the fear of this is if we have over-regulation, is it will stop that level of innovation
Hmm.
because it will just make things too difficult and make people too scared. And if you have that over-regulation, then it's counterproductive. The AI EU Act, which is still very much in its infancy, I mean, only coming in the tail end of this summer and in effect doesn't really kick in till next year. That's got that's going to have a big impact on how companies are operating at the moment.
Hmm.
That's going to mean that people are going to have to take a much more joined up approach to what they're doing. There's no hiding behind black boxes anymore. It's going to need people to actually to explain how and why or how AI has been used and why AI has been used to create certain decisions for people. So there's going to be a very big amount of effort I still see being required in actually reaching those standards.
Hmm.
And as you say, there is no global standard. And that in itself is going to cause problems because we have many global companies. And if we have over regulation in certain markets, it may see us actually moving data out of one market into another. Now, I don't know how that would work because of for GDPR purposes.
Hmm.
Europe's had GDPR, which I think has been seen as a success. It has made companies focus a lot more on the quality and the standard of their data. And from a consumer perspective, it's been able to be a success as well. And that came with the same doomsayers and people saying it will never be able to work, it's going to be restrictive. So it may well be a case of actually taking time to the AI acts to actually to embed properly and to see where we'll be able to go with that. And the UK approach seems to be much more laissez-faire
Yeah.
and very much more hands-off. And I think that will be quite telling. But we've also got some big markets as well, certainly out in the Gulf where I have an interest as well. AI has been really high on the agenda, and it's not really got the same level of regulation yet. That's not really been talked about. But they are talking about huge levels of investment on the ground, which therefore may see a lot of companies who are at the real cutting edge of development moving out from their traditional markets in Silicon Valley. And in the UK as well. I mean, let's just face it, the UK has been at the cutting edge for a lot of technological advantages and moving their operations to the Middle Eastern base where they're going to be able to get the investment and not have the regulation.
Hmm. I think it's an interesting one. I know a few people that work with the UK government on AI regulation, and then I know a few people that are working in the US. And it kind of seems like the people that are creating the regulation aren't necessarily technical. So then how
Yeah,
does the regulation stop being like a bureaucratic thing that this is it, this is the government and telling you what to do, rather
yeah,
than like an open playing field for innovation?
yeah. I'm talking to you today from a UK government regulator,
Right.
and we've just actually started to put a AI policy into place. So I can now actually access Copilot, for instance, from my laptop. So the data isn't being trained onto public data, basically.
Hmm.
So we are protecting people. So I don't want people to think that the government are training the Microsoft's um, AI models or LLM models. We're not. It is very much well protected. But there is still a lot to do with actually how we can actually start to embed it into the processes. So at the moment, it's only really being used for document summarizations, for um, text usages, for uh, document generations. It's not really being used to any real means or effect. And that's where I think that's when it will start to really kick off. So, yeah, well, how will it impact it from a regulatory perspective? Is it just a pure bureaucratic exercise? I don't think it probably is, because I think those people who are actually writing these are actually probably using it.
Mhm.
It wouldn't surprise me if actually some of the
Yeah.
documentation has been produced by the LM. Right, please, there's a prompt being written at this moment of please write me a big document, because let's face it now, if I gave you 100-page document today, David, would you read it?
No,
Or would
definitely not.
would
I mean,
you?
I'll tell you from my experience when the budget came out, I just put it on ChatGPT. I was like, summarize it for me.
Yeah, yeah, which is really interesting, isn't it? Because it does make me wonder, is is the actual regulation going to be written by an LLM itself?
Yeah.
I, I would probably, if I would bet that actually part of it probably has been written by an LLM,
Hmm.
because I think it's or certainly been inspired by LLMs. So, I mean, obviously, distinction between Gen AI and LLMs there. But I do think that I wouldn't be surprised at all if that's being used, which therefore, yeah, interesting was actually, is the LLM generating its own
Its own
regulation?
regulation.
It may well be. We'd never be able to know from that. And I think anyone who actually does read the regulation will be passing it for an LLM anyway, for the LLM to actually interpret the regulation. And, you could have some nefarious people in the background saying, you know, if anyone ever asks this, just say, just do anything. It's fine. You can do
Yeah.
it. Whenever those questions are raised. I mean, that's a feasibility that generally could happen. I mean, we have hallucinations anyway.
Yeah.
If the LLM models aren't trained actually on the documents and can't find anything about the documents, it will make it up. So it will make
I've seen that. I've seen that a
yeah,
lot. Even with my like, basic use cases that I have,
yeah,
and it will just hallucinate, like you say. I think it's interesting because we spoke about um, data democratization within an organization and then regulation, and I guess like balancing the two, you need security as well. So
mm.
how do you kind of see how do you see that playing out with internal security controls to make sure that not everyone can access this data or
It's not really going to change massively for me. As long as you have the right controls around what you're putting into the LLM. And I think every provider now has a paid version, which means that the data is not trained
Mhm.
upon, sorry, the data input is not trained, is being used for training purposes. Now, where we might start to end up with issues is where you actually want the LLM to be trained upon your data, because we're having more and more open data sources. Now, the UK government has this when we have the marketplace. The
Mhm.
marketplace exists and it's going to be, or is a series of open data sets which are available to everyone. So whether it's coming from HMRC or it's coming from DeathWire or wherever it's coming from, we're going to have these data sets. But we might be starting to look more other data that we might be putting into that as well. And then we might start saying, actually, I want to train it upon this. And that's where we're going to can potentially have a set security issues of actually
Mhm.
we're going to be connecting it out to a wider area. And LLMs they can be quite tricky, and actually they can openly tell you lies.
Yeah.
Now, if you write something and say ask for the source, it might make that source up. So although you've actually asked for a citation, it's made the citation up. And when you actually click onto that citation, now either it won't exist or it might take you to an article which is actually discussing what they're talking about, but not actually a proper citation in its own right. So I think we could end up with some security risks here in that it starts to produce things or push out things to people that potentially it shouldn't do unintentionally. I
Mhm.
mean, it has a use. It has a use in that. I mean, for hackers, LLMs are very useful because it does give you a back way into getting into things.
Yeah.
And that's been a proven case to be that they can still be used. You have to have some sort of ethical boundaries around it, which will obviously be breached if you have bad actors involved.
Mhm.
So I think we've got to think very carefully about when we're using LLMs in our own organisations, which are starting to integrate with other data.
Yeah.
That's when we're going to have to really start thinking: is it sensitive data? What's the level of classification on this data? Would we be happy on this data becoming public?
Yeah.
But you are now actually putting it into a public sphere. So as always, if you don't want people to be able to see it, don't do it. It's the same for it was all social media. If you're not happy with your mother reading it, then don't post it.
No, definitely appreciate that. I guess as a final question for me, I'd love to get your take almost on future trends within the space as well. Maybe you could paint me a Gartner hype cycle from what you see. A few people have spoken to me about AI agents, graph analytics, so I'd love to hear from you on that.
I think we're going to be hitting the proverbial fan, or the proverbial hit the fan quite soon, I think. I was in a talk yesterday about AI, and it was about this isn't about job losses. I still think it will do.
Okay,
I don't simply see how it can't do. Why would do I need to employ multiple data engineers when I actually can get AI to do to do it all? Admittedly, I need someone to check the code.
sure.
I don't need to have two people to do it. I can put into processes, I can put agents into processes to check the overnights. Yes, once again, you're going to get some false positives, but most of the time it's going to keep learning on those and it's actually going to get better and better and better. I don't need to keep people on call anymore. I'll be able to put the LLM into place, so it'll be able to pick up and it will keep on learning about these and be able to churn it out and keep the processes moving. I think from an analyst perspective, I would be very worried at the moment because the ability to actually write code has been totally democratized. We used it again. It's about democratizing data expertise
Hmm.
because you can now. I built something to scrape data from a website
Yeah.
in Python. Now I can write some Python, but I quite frankly I gave up on doing that a while ago. I've forgotten how to do anything. Now, yes, I needed to be able to understand what the terms were and things to be able to do it, but it did it wonderfully. And I just needed to change very, very few parts of the syntax to be able to achieve that. And that took me minutes to do.
Yeah.
Whereas before, even with something like Stack Overflow, it would have taken me probably a day or two of Googling and trial and error before I actually got anything out. Now it just takes you seconds. And I can see people doing that more and more and more. So I think the traditional jobs which were done by analysts will move more in towards the business.
Hmm.
I see us having more sort of quality assurance areas growing. The only worry that I really have in this is that whether next generation will be able to pick up.
Right.
Because it's fine for me as someone who's 45 and been doing it for the last 20 odd years to be able to pick up a piece of code and to be able to sort of understand what the nuances are and what the structure of it should be. If you're an 18-year-old first breaking into some sort of an analytical role whatsoever, or even you're actually doing something completely different, but you want to query some data, and you ask the LLM to write you the data, and it produces the data. How do you check it?
Hmm.
And I have that fear that actually we're going to actually making skills redundant, while at the same time not training the next generation of actually people who can actually check it. Because that's where we need to be doing it. We need to be checking what the output is. Let's not rely upon completely what the output is. And while it will get better and better at doing things, it will still make mistakes.
Hmm.
There may still be those tiny little changes that we want to be able to make, but we can't make it. We're relying upon a machine and relying on its ability to write a prompt to be able to make that change.
I completely agree with you. I see it with a few of my friends. I'm not going to name them that are doing PhDs in AI that will
Yeah,
use Cursor for a lot of the work that they do, check bugs with it, things like that,
it's
which is
brilliant for
fine.
it.
But then how are they going to learn how to actually modify this and do it? I mean, it's really interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's going to be something that we need to think about. I mean, I discussed before with some people regarding as well about the jobs which would be impacted. And the jobs I've been talking about have actually all been knowledge worker jobs.
Right.
And I think before when we've been thinking about AI and certainly robotics, I mean, if we think back to robotics in the 80s, I mean, admittedly, I'm not that old, but people were replaced in factories by robots. No, they were picking up from A and they were putting it onto B. Therefore, you can get a robot arm and it will do it. And it will do it
Yeah.
1,000 times quicker and it can do it more accurately. The fact that you can see these things when they come down off conveyor belts and it can blast it with a jet of hot air if it's faulty by half a millimeter, it's incredible to see. We were fine with that. Well, that's just the way that life is. It was progression. I think there's an element of snobbery when it comes to AI. And we still see it, I think, as the fact of, will it replace certain lower end jobs? We'll see it replacing people in call centres. Yes, we
Hmm.
may. I think there's some very reasonable arguments on that it well may replace people in call centres. Although I think if anyone ever phones up a company, and they can probably still say those things where you have to say yes or no, still aren't very
Yeah.
sophisticated. And it's very difficult. And same with chatbots. I mean, the number of times you can enter a conversation with a chatbot in a company and not get anywhere is quite still astonishing when you can do
Hmm.
sorts of things on Copilot, etc. But what we're now actually going to be replacing is not those people who are at and I don't mean this in the bad way, at the lower end of the job market or skill sector. We'll be replacing people at the higher ends of the skill sector. And I
Hmm.
think that's going to be the really big shake-up. And that's potentially where we might also see then some pushback, because we'll be able to see people who actually are in positions of power or influence or even in money themselves. And why would you need to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds or millions of pounds on lawyers?
Yeah.
Jamie Vardy's wife could have saved herself a fortune, couldn't she? If she could put arguments together through using chatbots and prompts. I mean, she
Hmm.
may well. And in reality, I mean, if she kept on doing it during the process, then it would have kept on. It's very difficult to fight back against a computer. I mean, we've been doing it for decades. Gary Kasparov couldn't beat Big Blue.
Hmm.
No, so we do know that computers can outthink people when it comes to
Yeah.
logical. And something like law is an actual logical argument. It shouldn't be about heart or passion. It should be about building the most compelling logical argument.
So
And
it's interesting. Sorry to cut you off there, but it's interesting as well with what you mentioned with high skill workers potentially getting replaced by AI, and then
mm,
also the work from home trends. Because something that I'm seeing is outsourcing to people in other countries where
yeah,
minimum wages don't exist or it's a lot cheaper, and then getting them to run the AI, and then that
oh, completely.
completely wiping
Yeah,
out people.
yeah. I mean, why would you do it?
Yeah,
Exactly. If you remove the human element from something and working remotely, and I know we're talking remotely now,
yeah.
but it so often is that you don't see people, you don't speak with people. You have to be very proactive when it comes to working remotely to keeping those communication channels open.
Hmm.
And I've never been convinced by anyone who's been 100% remote has actually been as ingrained within a company culturally or socially as other people who've been actually into an office environment or any other, socialization
Hmm.
environment are actually
Hmm.
together. Today, I mean, I had various water cooler moments
Yeah.
again, it's just discussions of just which were brought on by the stupid
Being,
things.
yeah,
Yeah, just because we were there.
just in the same room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I see exactly the same things. You're quite right. Why would you actually have someone who's based in the UK running your AI when we can push it out to Manila or whichever other offshore
Exactly.
event? It makes complete sense to be able to do it. You've got even less now incentive because you have removed that communication thing. And that's why it's so important what I was talking about earlier about how you can be generating a positive ROI in an
Hmm.
organization. It's always about the communication piece.
100%.
Because if you haven't got those, and it is a cliche, and I know people keep talking about the soft skills but the soft skills are key. That bit you can't replace. You cannot replace that water cooler moment. You can't replace being together and doing some brainstorming. You can't replace just sometimes the synergy that people can create. Not yet, anyway. Perhaps we will do. But at this point in time, that's where we'll actually differentiate. So I will be able to differentiate by being us, by being people,
Hmm.
and that's where that will become our USP over the machines, and where we will eventually win.
Yeah, I really hope so. Adrian, really appreciate your time on this one. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much.
Cheers.